Greetings, fellow viewers. Well, we're right now in front of the Howard Cemetery, which is one of the oldest ones here in Salem. It's the second of the 3 cemeteries we're going to visit on our trip. And as we enter, we notice beside the lovely sunset that the stones are spread quite far apart. So this is still in a time when burial space was not so much of a problem, and a lot of the stones here were actually not stones, but they were made of wood. But as time went on and the elements had actually ruined the wood a little too readily, I suppose for the then living descendants of the deceased, they were eventually replaced with stone. If you take a look at some of the graves here, starting from well, the ones closest to the entrance, this one dates back to 1866. 1886, it's hard to say, either right after the Civil War, 20 years thereafter.
We should head to the back corner.
Okay. The interesting thing about the cemetery is it's also the location of the execution of Giles Cory, or Cory Giles, yes? Giles, who was one of the people in the Salem witch trials, actually the only person who was not hung but pressed to death. And it took several days for him to die. His last words were, "Add more weight." Some of these stones, by the way, no longer even seem to have any writing on them, unless it's on the other side. Oh yes, it's on the other side. This one seems to date back to 1812, so now it's already the beginning of the 19th century. Perhaps as you go further into the back, the graves tend to get older. You do notice a certain difference of architecture in the stones, not in the composition, not just in the composition of materials, but in the actual styles of writing and the very English itself. This stone dates to 1820. E. Mosley and Moriarty. Well, not quite. Professor Moriarty of Arthur Conan Doyle fame for Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
Probably a different Moriarty, yes?
Yes.
But this is also the location not only
Hon, you're walking too fast.
Oh, sorry. But the place of the jail, the original Salem jail, is that it, the building?
Well,
I don't know which one of these. We'd have to look closer. That seems to be residential now, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know if the original jail is here, but the original jail was supposed to be in the back corner of Howard Cemetery. It's where the victims of...
I can actually turn the camera on you at this point. Not a problem. Yes, go ahead.
It's where the victims of the witch trials were held until their trial and then summary execution.
Some were held up for up to 7 years if they were able to pay for the fees of their trials, which I'm sure they did not request, huh? A little has changed since that time.
But you can kind of see this is a very old cemetery. These big, larger blocks are along the kind of bump that divides the cemetery for some reason. And then at the very front, you can't see it unless you walk up here, there's this really kind of interesting retaining wall that's holding the cemetery in place.
Yes, and some of the stones have actually started to lean forward. It's difficult to tell exactly how long they've been leaning forward. It could be for a few years, it could be for decades, but they look like they're about to tip over. One of the stones here, for example, is leaning right over there, but some of the leans were actually a little bit more extreme, and yet the stones held up.
This cemetery is said to be haunted by Giles' ghost from being pressed to death, and it is the burial spot of the writer.
Nathaniel Hawthorne?
Not the writer, the writer.
Oh, Paul Revere?
Paul Revere.
Yes.
So, interesting. And again, you look at this cemetery, it's a little haphazard. Some of the stones are broken, but this is more like clearly due to age than lack of upkeep. But you can look at a stone like this. That is from...
This is more recent.
1865.
Well, it was actually a more well-done stone to begin with. Perhaps the people were a little bit wealthier.
Cotton.
Huh?
Cotton, Captain Cotton and Pratt were two
of the descendants, yes, of John Cotton, right? And the interesting story with John Cotton is, as you said, he had
So Cotton was the major mayor or judge in Boston, and 4 years before the Salem witch trials, he actually hung a number of
accused witches 4 years before, in 1688. Yes, this is 4 years before the Salem witch trials in 1692, and there was a book about this. Yes.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
And after he went through the trials, hung these 3 girls. They were sisters. He wrote a book about the experience.
The Goodwin sisters or something?
The Goodwin sisters. Yeah. And he wrote a book about this, and about 2 years after those trials, and about a year before the Salem witch trials, Paris, the reverend of the daughter that started the hysteria, had purchased that book, and he was known to have it. And it was basically how he determined that witchcraft was afoot in Salem. So, and from what I understand, the stories of Boston and Salem were very, very similar, as a girl blamed her housekeeper, which was a slave.
Tituba.
Well, in Boston.
Oh, in Boston as well.
Yeah.
The whole scenario was played out identically in Boston and later in Salem, but the history of Boston was completely omitted from this. And Salem seemed to be a repetition of it, be it on a larger scale, be it nowhere near as large as was about 20,000 to 30,000, to some accounts 40,000 people who were put to death during the Inquisition in Europe.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, it almost seemed like the witch trials were more a diversion from the, you know...
Well, the whole thing about the witch trials, it had very little to do with
witchcraft
magic and
yes.
The devil per se. The fact was that the Puritans had come up against the King of England,
King Charles III,
and
who hated them,
who had revoked their charter. And so they had fought to get the charter back, but during the time of the witch trials, they actually didn't have the charter. So this is why Cotton from Boston ended up coming down and being one of the judges on the panel that tried these cases. And it's also a part of the reason why so many people, there was 150 people originally arrested in the first kind of draft of the hysteria. Why it took so long for them to be released beyond paying for their bills, because at that point the city had no charter and no authority to try them, which is what Giles Cory was standing on, and why he said he refused to stand trial, that they had no authority. The Puritans, though, were really trying to exert their control. They lost their charter, which gave them the ability of self-rule here in the United States. Much of their land had been taken away and seized. And what's interesting, we'll go to the third cemetery, and we'll talk about some of the key, the sheriff and magistrate. But the interesting thing is, 3 of the 4 judges were the richest people in Boston at the time, and all of the people that were convicted had their land seized. And
that's really what a lot of the Salem witch trials were about. It wasn't about fighting witchcraft. It was about a pretense to seize land and other political maneuvers that actually had originated in Boston. But the history of it associated with Boston is seldom spoken of. And even as we found out today in Salem, the witch trials could not openly be discussed until 1839.
Yeah.
Right? Despite
Yes.
their passage in 1692, so they couldn't be discussed for almost 150 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Almost that.